The Galactic Embassy's childcare facility was, by all accounts, a marvel of interspecies cooperation, which is to say it was a barely controlled chaos of scales, tentacles, and the occasional small explosion. The designers had optimistically called it adaptive architecture, but really it was just a bunch of reinforced walls and furniture that could theoretically survive whatever the galaxy's most diplomatically important offspring could dish out. Today's particular brand of mayhem was courtesy of 3 Draknari cubs who had been deposited there while their mother, Velka, attended yet another thrilling session on interstellar trade route optimization. Because nothing says productive diplomacy quite like leaving your fire-breathing children with complete strangers for 6 hours. Flint, the eldest at what humans might consider 8 years old, was currently engaged in a heated debate with a crystalline youngling over the proper way to stack building blocks. The debate involved actual heat, naturally. Small puffs of orange flame accompanied his increasingly animated gestures as he explained the finer points of structural engineering according to Draknari physics. His sister, Ember, smaller but twice as fierce, had claimed the reading corner as her personal domain. She'd built an impressive fortress out of cushions and was defending it against all comers with the sort of strategic brilliance that would make military tacticians weep. The fact that she occasionally singed the fabric when particularly excited only added to the fortress's intimidating aesthetic. The youngest, Spark, lived up to his name by bouncing between his siblings like a scaled ping-pong ball, leaving tiny scorch marks on whatever he touched. His enthusiasm was matched only by his complete inability to control either his flame output or his volume level. Every sentence came out as either a whisper or a roar, with no middle ground whatsoever. The facility's staff had long since learned to keep fire extinguishers within arm's reach whenever Draknari young were in residence. Not because the cubs were dangerous. They were actually quite sweet once you got past the whole literal fire breath thing, but because excitement and flame control didn't exactly go hand in hand at their age. "Flint's being mean about my blocks," Spark announced to the room at large, his voice carrying the sort of righteous indignation that only children could muster. A small jet of blue flame punctuated his complaint. "Your blocks?" Flint's scales rippled with amusement. "They're everyone's blocks, little spark brain." "Don't call me spark brain. More flames. These ones decidedly more orange and considerably warmer." From her cushioned fortress, Ember sighed with the world-weary air of someone far older than her actual age. "You're both being ridiculous. The blocks clearly belong to whoever can build the best structure, which is obviously me." She gestured grandly toward her fortress, and a perfectly controlled stream of golden fire traced elegant patterns in the air above the cushions. Show off. The facility's automated monitoring systems, bless their digital hearts, had been dutifully recording elevated heat signatures and increased decibel levels for the past 20 minutes. Somewhere in the embassy's security center, various colored lights were blinking with increasing urgency, because apparently 3 children having a perfectly normal sibling discussion was cause for tactical alerts. Korth, the embassy's chief of security, was having what could charitably be called a bad day. The insectoid officer's compound eyes were designed to track multiple threats simultaneously, but even evolution hadn't prepared him for the particular brand of chaos that diplomatic childcare presented. His afternoon had started reasonably enough. A few minor disputes between trade delegations, one diplomat who'd gotten lost trying to find the cafeteria, and the usual complaints about the temperature settings in Conference Room B. Standard embassy business. Then the alerts had started coming in from the childcare facility. Elevated thermal readings. Check. Increased vocalization levels. Double check. Potential combustion events detected. Triple check with a side of impending headache. Korth's mandibles clicked together in what passed for a sigh among his species. Draknari younglings were challenging. Their idea of play often involved controlled pyrotechnics, and their version of indoor voices could rattle windows 3 floors away. Add in their natural pack mentality and tendency to view any form of authority as a personal challenge, and you had a recipe for administrative nightmares. The final straw came in the form of a priority message from the embassy's upper management. Apparently, some bureaucrat in a comfortable office had decided that the childcare facility was becoming too disruptive to the important business of politics. The solution, naturally, was to relocate the problematic elements to a more secure and isolated environment. In other words, take the dragon cubs away from their toys and friends and stick them somewhere quiet where the adults wouldn't have to hear them being, well, children. Korth stared at the relocation order for a long moment, his antennae twitching with the sort of resigned irritation that came with working in middle management across the galaxy. He'd dealt with security breaches, diplomatic incidents, and the occasional actual invasion attempt. Somehow, none of those had prepared him for the delicate art of explaining to fire-breathing children why they needed to move to what amounted to a very nice jail cell. He gathered his security team, 3 other Hyvanari officers who looked about as thrilled with this assignment as he felt, and headed toward the childcare facility. The plan was simple: explain the situation, pack up the cubs' belongings, and escort them to the new location with minimal fuss. It was a good plan. It was a reasonable plan. It was exactly the sort of plan that the universe delighted in destroying with extreme prejudice. The cubs sensed trouble the moment Korth and his team entered the facility. It wasn't anything dramatic. No sudden silence or ominous music. Just that subtle shift in attention that children everywhere seemed hardwired to detect. The moment when adults stopped being background noise and became something that required immediate and complete assessment. Flint's head snapped up from his building blocks. Ember peered over the ramparts of her cushion fortress. Spark stopped bouncing and planted his feet, tiny wisps of smoke curling from his nostrils. "Flint," Ember said quietly, her voice carrying none of its earlier playfulness. "Why are the security bugs looking at us like that?" "I don't know," Flint replied, moving subtly to position himself between his siblings and the approaching officers. "But I don't think they're here for story time." Korth cleared his throat, a sound like autumn leaves being shuffled by mechanical feet. "Young Draknari, we need to discuss a change in your accommodations. You'll be moving to a new location within the embassy." The temperature in the room seemed to drop and rise simultaneously. The other non-Draknari children began quietly backing away from the conversation, their own species' survival instincts kicking in with admirable efficiency. "Where?" Flint asked, and there was something in his tone that made Korth's exoskeleton itch. "A more suitable facility," one of Korth's officers supplied helpfully. "More appropriate for your particular needs." Which was exactly the wrong thing to say to 3 young Draknari who had spent their entire lives being told that their particular needs made them difficult, dangerous, or different. Ember emerged from her fortress, her golden scales beginning to shimmer with heat. "We like it here. We're not going anywhere without our mother." "Your mother is in an important meeting," Korth said, trying for a reasonable tone. "She's agreed to this relocation for everyone's safety and comfort." It was a lie, of course. Velka had no idea what was happening in the childcare facility. She was currently 3 floors up, debating shipping regulations with the patience of someone who had dealt with bureaucracy for several decades. But Korth figured a little creative interpretation of the truth was justified if it avoided a scene. Unfortunately, Draknari children were remarkably good at detecting lies. Something about enhanced senses and pack instincts made them natural truth detectors, especially when it came to adults who were trying to manipulate them. The cubs exchanged glances. Not words, glances. The sort of silent communication that siblings develop when they've spent their entire lives as a unit against the world. No, Spark said simply. It was a small word, delivered by the smallest of the three cubs, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. Backed up by the quiet solidarity of his siblings and punctuated by a small but decidedly intentional puff of flame. Korth felt his afternoon transition from bad to potentially career-ending with the sort of swift certainty that only comes from years of experience in crisis management. "This isn't a request," he said, signaling his officers to begin moving toward the cubs. "Please gather your belongings. We'll make this as easy as possible." The cubs didn't move. They didn't argue. They didn't throw tantrums or demand to speak to their mother. They simply stood there, three small figures arranged in a defensive triangle, and radiated the sort of quiet determination that had made their species legendary across the galaxy. Because here's the thing about Draknari children that the embassy's bureaucrats had apparently forgotten. They weren't just small dragons. They were small dragons with functioning brains, strong family bonds, and absolutely no patience for adults who thought they could be pushed around simply because they were young. The security team moved forward with their containment equipment, stun nets, restraint fields, the usual tools for dealing with uncooperative subjects. Standard procedure, really. Nothing personal. That's when the cubs decided that diplomacy was officially over, and it was time to remind everyone why their species had a reputation for being spectacularly difficult to intimidate. The first small jet of flame was almost casual. Just Ember letting off a little steam, really. Nothing threatening about it. Just a gentle reminder that maybe, possibly, the security team might want to reconsider their current course of action. The second jet came from Flint, slightly larger and considerably more pointed in its delivery. A polite but firm suggestion that personal space was a concept that should be respected. The third came from Spark, and while it was small, it was delivered with the sort of precision that suggested he'd been practicing. Korth's mandibles clicked together rapidly, the Hivenari equivalent of nervous laughter. "Now, younglings, let's discuss this rationally." But the cubs were done with rational discussion. They were done with adults making decisions about their lives without consulting them. They were done with being treated like problems to be solved rather than people to be respected. And most importantly, they were done with anyone who thought they could be moved around like furniture just because they happened to be smaller than everyone else in the room. The temperature began to rise, and Korth realized with growing alarm that his simple relocation assignment was about to become something considerably more complicated. What happened next could best be described as a master class in why you should never underestimate the tactical capabilities of children who happen to breathe fire for a living. The security team's first mistake was assuming that containment nets designed for adult criminals would work on juvenile Draknari who had spent their entire lives playing games that involved not getting caught. The nets deployed with military precision, sailing through the air toward their targets, with the confidence of technology meeting a simple problem. They met three small dragons who had been playing Dodge the Grown-Ups since they could walk. Flint dropped and rolled with fluid grace, the net passing harmlessly over his head. Ember simply wasn't where the net expected her to be, having somehow relocated to the top of a bookshelf with the sort of casual defiance of physics that made Korth's compound eyes water. Spark, the youngest and theoretically least coordinated, performed what could only be described as a combat somersault that would have impressed professional acrobats. The nets hit the floor with the sad whisper of expensive equipment, meeting complete failure. "Okay," Korth muttered to his officers. "Maybe we approach this differently." His second-in-command, a fellow Hivnari named Vorth, clicked his mandibles uncertainly. "Stun fields?" "Stun fields," Korth agreed, because apparently today was the day he learned exactly how many terrible decisions could be crammed into a single afternoon. The portable stun field generators hummed to life, projecting crackling barriers of energy designed to temporarily incapacitate hostile targets. They were non-lethal, completely safe, and absolutely perfect for subduing uncooperative individuals without causing permanent harm. They were also designed for beings who didn't generate their own internal heat sources capable of overloading electronic equipment. Ember took one look at the approaching energy fields and smiled. It was not a reassuring expression on a face equipped with actual fangs. "That's not very nice," she said conversationally, and exhaled. The flame that emerged from her small muzzle was golden, controlled, and precisely calibrated to interfere with the electromagnetic frequencies that the stun fields required to function. The barriers flickered, sparked, and died, with the electronic equivalent of confused whimpering. Flint nodded approvingly. "Good technique, sister. But watch this." His flame was different, deeper orange, with more raw heat than precision. It washed over the now-defunct stun field generators and turned several thousand credits worth of security equipment into very expensive paperweights. Spark, not to be outdone, contributed his own jet of blue fire that somehow managed to trace perfect spirals in the air before dissipating harmlessly near the ceiling. It served no tactical purpose whatsoever, but it looked absolutely magnificent and conveyed the unmistakable message that he was having the time of his life. "Right," Korth said, his voice climbing toward frequencies that his species typically reserved for genuine panic. "New plan. We call for backup." "Sir," Vorth said carefully, "are you sure that's wise? The Cubs aren't actually attacking us. They're just not cooperating." Which was true. For all their impressive pyrotechnics, the young Draknari were being remarkably restrained. Their flames were defensive, designed to disable equipment rather than harm people. They could have turned the security team into a collection of slightly crispy insects, but they were choosing not to. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Korth was having the sort of day where reasonable observations got trampled by the urgent need to do something before his supervisors decided he was incompetent. "They're resisting lawful relocation orders with potentially lethal force," he announced, which was technically true if you squinted hard enough, and ignored the part where no one was actually in danger. "We need containment specialists and heavy restraint equipment." The Cubs exchanged another one of those silent sibling communications, and this time their expressions shifted from playful resistance to something considerably more serious. "Heavy restraint equipment?" Ember repeated, her golden scales beginning to glow with increasing heat. "For us?" "We're children," Flint pointed out, with the sort of reasonable tone that adults always found deeply unsettling when it came from someone they were trying to intimidate. "We're not criminals." "Yeah," Spark added, his voice cracking with indignation. "We didn't do anything wrong. We just don't want to go to Dragon Jail." Which was, admittedly, a fairly accurate assessment of the situation. But Korth was committed now, in the way that middle management everywhere commits to bad decisions rather than admit they might have been wrong. The backup arrived within minutes because the embassy's security department was nothing if not efficient. More officers, more equipment, and most importantly, more witnesses to what was rapidly becoming the most embarrassing incident of Korth's career. The Cubs watched the reinforcements arrive with the sort of calm attention that seasoned warriors might give to enemy troop movements. They were still clustered in their defensive triangle, but now there was something different about their posture. Less playful resistance, more serious evaluation of an evolving threat. "Okay, younglings," Korth announced, his voice amplified by a portable speaker system. "This is your final warning. Submit to relocation immediately, or we'll be forced to use more aggressive containment measures." The Cubs looked at him. They looked at the assembled security force. They looked at the various pieces of equipment being unpacked and calibrated. They looked at each other. And then they made a collective decision that would be talked about in embassy security briefings for decades to come. "No," they said, in perfect unison. What followed was not a battle exactly. Battles imply some degree of equality between opposing forces. This was more like watching a group of professionals discover that all their training, equipment, and tactical expertise meant absolutely nothing when facing opponents who could fly, breathe fire, and coordinate their movements with telepathic precision. The Cubs didn't just resist, they dominated. Flint took point, his flames creating a barrier of superheated air that made it impossible for the security team to approach directly. Ember provided mobile support, darting between cover positions and disabling equipment with surgical precision. Spark, the youngest and supposedly least dangerous, turned out to have a gift for psychological warfare, producing the most ear-splitting roars that echoed through the facility's ventilation system. Within minutes, the childcare facility had been transformed into what military tacticians might call a contested zone, and what any reasonable observer would call a very expensive playground where the children were winning. The Cubs had turned every piece of furniture into a defensive position. Toy blocks became projectiles. Cushions became mobile cover. The reading corner became a command post, from which Ember coordinated their increasingly sophisticated defensive strategy. "This is insane," one of the security officers muttered, crouched behind an overturned table while small jets of flame periodically reminded him to keep his head down. "They're children," another officer protested. "How are children this good at tactical combat?" Which was exactly the wrong question to ask, because it implied that being small meant being helpless, and the Cubs were currently in the process of demonstrating just how incorrect that assumption was. Korth activated the facility's emergency protocols, because, apparently, his day hadn't reached peak catastrophe yet. Alarms began wailing throughout the embassy, emergency blast doors sealed the childcare facility, and automated systems began evacuating all non-essential personnel from the surrounding areas. The other young diplomats, the crystalline younglings, the aquatic spawn, the various other small beings who had been quietly playing during this entire confrontation, were efficiently relocated to safe zones by embassy staff who were much better at their jobs than the security team, which left the Cubs alone in their makeshift fortress, surrounded by what was rapidly becoming a significant percentage of the embassy's security force, while alarms wailed and emergency lights bathed everything in dramatic red lighting. "Well," Ember said conversationally from her position atop a barricade of educational materials, "this escalated quickly." "I think we're winning," Spark observed, sounding surprised but pleased. Flint was less optimistic. "We're holding our position, but they're going to bring heavier equipment soon, and eventually they'll just wait us out." Which was true. The Cubs were putting up an impressive fight, but they were still children, and children got tired, hungry, and eventually overwhelmed by adult persistence. Their flame reserves weren't infinite, and sooner or later, Korth's forces would figure out a way to counter their defensive advantages. But for now, in this moment, Three small dragons had turned a simple relocation order into what security reports would later describe as a significant tactical engagement resulting in extensive property damage and a complete failure of operational objectives. The Cubs had made their point with fire and fury, and that point was simple. Just because someone was bigger, older, and theoretically in charge didn't mean they could push children around without consequences. Of course, making a point and actually winning were two very different things. The Cubs were about to learn the difference between dramatic resistance and practical problem-solving. They just didn't know it yet. Korth stood in the corridor outside the sealed facility, looking at tactical displays that showed three small heat signatures holding defensive positions against a security force that was supposed to be handling routine embassy operations, not conducting siege warfare against elementary school students. His superiors were asking increasingly pointed questions about why a simple relocation had turned into whatever this was. His officers were requesting hazard pay for dealing with hostile combustion sources. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, this entire situation could have been handled differently. But Korth had committed to his course of action, and Hivanari were nothing if not persistent. If the Cubs wanted to make this difficult, then difficult it would be. He was about to learn that sometimes difficult problems required solutions that came from completely unexpected directions. The Cubs settled in for what they assumed would be a prolonged siege, their flames flickering with determination and their young hearts full of righteous fury. They had no idea that their salvation was about to arrive in the form of the one being in the entire embassy that everyone else had completely forgotten to consider. But revolutions, even small ones, often begin in the most unlikely places, with the most overlooked people, at the most inconvenient times. And this particular revolution was about to meet its most unexpected ally. Lux had been mopping the same section of corridor for the past 10 minutes, which was either a testament to his dedication to cleanliness or evidence that he was the nosiest janitor in galactic history. Given that he'd positioned himself within perfect earshot of the childcare facility's chaos, nosiness seemed more likely. The human maintenance worker had a particular talent for being simultaneously invisible and everywhere at once. It was a skill he'd developed over months of working in the embassy, where being human meant occupying a unique position in the galactic hierarchy. Technically sentient, generally harmless, and utterly beneath the notice of anyone important, which made him the perfect observer for situations that everyone else was too busy managing to actually understand. He'd watched the security team march toward the childcare facility with their equipment and their confidence. He'd listened to the increasingly frantic radio chatter as their simple relocation turned into what sounded like a military engagement. He'd observed other embassy staff evacuating younglings from adjacent areas while shooting worried glances at the sealed blast doors. Most importantly, he'd been listening to the sounds coming from inside the facility itself. Not just the alarms and the shouting, but the smaller sounds underneath. The particular pitch of children's voices when they were scared rather than angry. The way their flame bursts were timed. Defensive rather than aggressive. The careful coordination that spoke of siblings protecting each other rather than random violence. Everyone else heard a security incident. Lux heard 3 kids who were in way over their heads and trying desperately to stay together. "Sir," one of Korth's officers was saying into his comm unit, "the subjects are maintaining defensive positions. Request permission to deploy advanced containment protocols." Advanced containment protocols. For children. Lux's grip tightened on his mop handle. He'd seen those protocols in action during his brief stint in maintenance for the embassy's detention levels. Electromagnetic restraint fields designed to completely immobilize subjects. sensory dampening systems that cut off sight, sound, and smell, neural static generators that made coherent thought nearly impossible, effective for dangerous criminals, potentially traumatic for young beings who were already terrified and separated from their parent. Lux made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him as the quiet human who fixed broken dispensers and cleaned up after diplomatic incidents. He set down his mop, straightened his maintenance coveralls, and walked directly toward the sealed blast doors. "Hey," he called out to the nearest security officer. "Those doors still functional, or did the little ones break the access controls too?" The officer, a young Hyvanari who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, glanced nervously toward Korth before answering. "The doors are sealed under emergency protocols. No one goes in or out without command authorization." "Right," Lux nodded thoughtfully. "And how's that working out for everyone?" Which was exactly the sort of question that highlighted the gap between theoretical authority and practical results. The security team had successfully contained 3 children in a single room, but they'd also managed to turn a routine relocation into an embassy-wide emergency that was generating the kind of paperwork that ended careers. Lux pulled out his maintenance tablet and began scrolling through building schematics with the casual efficiency of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Emergency protocols automatically engage ventilation system overrides to prevent atmospheric contamination, right? The officer nodded uncertainly. "Which means there's independent air circulation to prevent anyone from suffocating if the room gets sealed for extended periods." Another nod. "And maintenance access to that system doesn't fall under security lockdowns, because you can't have repair crews waiting for authorization every time someone needs to fix a broken air filter." The officer's compound eyes widened as he realized where this conversation was heading. "Sir, you can't just—" "Can't just what?" Lux asked mildly. "Fix a potential ventilation problem that's been flagged in my maintenance queue? Pretty sure that's exactly what I'm supposed to do." He held up his tablet, which displayed a work order that had been generated the moment the emergency systems engaged. Standard automated protocol. Anytime a room got sealed, maintenance got notified to monitor life support systems. Korth's voice crackled over the comm system. "Maintenance personnel are to maintain safe distance from the containment zone until the situation is resolved." Lux looked at the officer, then at his tablet, then back at the officer. "Funny thing about maintenance work, it's not really optional. Building systems don't care about security situations. They just care about whether they're working properly." He started walking toward the maintenance access panel, his movements casual and unhurried. Behind him, he could hear increasingly frantic radio chatter as the security team tried to figure out whether they had the authority to stop a human janitor from doing his job. The maintenance tunnels that ran through the embassy were designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Narrow crawlways, endless pipes, and the constant hum of machinery that kept the building functioning. They were also completely separate from the main security grid, because architects had learned long ago that you couldn't have repair crews asking permission every time they needed to fix something. Lux navigated the tunnels with the confidence of someone who'd spent months learning every shortcut, access point, and forgotten corner of the embassy's infrastructure. He'd fixed broken dispensers in the diplomatic suites, replaced air filters in the conference rooms, and unclogged drainage systems that served species with wildly different biological needs. He'd also learned that the fastest way to understand any situation was to listen to the people who were actually experiencing it, rather than the people who were trying to manage it. The ventilation grate that opened into the childcare facility was positioned near the ceiling, behind a cluster of decorative plants that the interior designers had optimistically installed to create a calming, natural environment. The plants were somewhat singed now, but they still provided excellent cover for someone who needed to observe without being observed. Through the grate, Lux could see the cubs in their improvised fortress. They were still, maintaining their defensive positions, but he could see the exhaustion starting to set in. Spark was swaying slightly, his flames flickering with fatigue. Ember's golden glow was dimming. Flint was still alert, but his movements had the careful precision of someone running on determination rather than energy. They were holding their ground, but they wouldn't be able to do it much longer. And when their defenses finally failed, they'd face whatever advanced containment protocols the security team had in mind, unless someone gave them a better option. Lux quietly removed the ventilation grate and lowered himself into the room with the sort of practiced stealth that came from years of maintenance work in occupied spaces. His feet touched the floor with barely a whisper, and he took a moment to assess the situation from ground level. The cubs were arranged in their defensive triangle about 20 feet away, focused entirely on the sealed blast doors where they expected the next attack to come from. They hadn't noticed his entrance, which was exactly what he'd hoped for. Moving slowly and keeping his hands visible, Lux walked toward them, with the sort of casual approach that janitors used when entering occupied rooms. Not threatening, not sneaky, just someone going about their business who happened to be sharing the same space. "Afternoon," he said conversationally, as if dropping into besieged childcare facilities was just another part of his daily routine. 3 small dragon heads snapped toward him with startling synchronization. 3 sets of eyes locked onto the human who had somehow appeared in their sealed fortress without triggering any of their carefully maintained defenses. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant wail of emergency alarms and the quiet hum of life support systems. "Who are you?" Flint asked, his voice carrying the sort of wary politeness that suggested he was ready to either have a conversation or breathe fire, depending on how the next few seconds went. "Lux," he replied simply. "I fix things around here. Looks like there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Ember peered at him from behind her barricade of educational materials. "Are you here to take us to Dragon Jail too?" "Dragon Jail." Lux's eyebrows rose. "Is that what they told you? That you were going to jail?" "They set her location to a more secure facility," Spark said, his young voice perfectly mimicking the official tone Korth had used earlier. "But everyone knows that's just fancy talk for jail." Lux nodded thoughtfully, as if this was perfectly reasonable logic, which, from the cub's perspective, it probably was. "And you don't want to go to this secure facility?" "We want to stay here until our mother comes back," Flint said firmly. "We didn't do anything wrong. We were just playing, and then the security bugs showed up and started pointing their zappy things at us." "Security bugs?" Lux glanced toward the sealed doors. "Ah, you mean the Hive Nari officers, and the zappy things would be the stun fields." "They were going to hurt us," Ember added, her scales shimmering with residual heat. "So we defended ourselves. But we were careful. We only broke their equipment, not them." Which was true, and spoke to a level of restraint that the security reports would probably overlook entirely. The cubs could have seriously injured the officers, but they'd chosen to disable equipment instead. They were scared children trying to protect themselves, not dangerous criminals. Lux sat down cross-legged on the floor, a gesture that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Adults who wanted to intimidate children stayed standing. Adults who wanted to talk sat down and made themselves equal. "Sounds like you've been having a pretty rough day," he said. The cubs exchanged glances, and something in their posture began to relax. Not much. They were still ready to defend themselves, but enough to suggest that maybe, possibly, this particular adult might be different from the others. "Are you going to try to make us leave too?" Spark asked. Lux considered this carefully. "Well, I'm not security, so I can't make you do anything. I'm just maintenance. I fix broken things and clean up messes." He looked around at the flame-scorched furniture and scattered equipment. "And this definitely qualifies as a mess." "We didn't mean to make a mess," Ember said quickly. "We just didn't want to be taken away from here. This is where our mother left us. This is where she'll come back to find us." And there it was, the heart of the entire situation. The cubs weren't being defiant or destructive for the sake of causing trouble. They were terrified children who had been separated from their parent and told they were going to be moved again to a place that sounded suspiciously like punishment. Their resistance was just 3 kids trying to stay where their mother could find them. Lux reached into his maintenance bag and pulled out his lunch, a simple sandwich, some fruit, and a thermos of coffee that was probably cold by now. "Anyone hungry? Fighting security teams is probably exhausting work." The cubs stared at him as if he'd just offered them the crown jewels of the galaxy. When was the last time an adult had offered them food instead of demands? When was the last time someone had acknowledged that they might be tired, scared, or in need of basic comfort? Spark's stomach chose that moment to announce its emptiness with a rumble that could probably be heard in the corridor outside. "I could eat something," he admitted sheepishly. Lux divided his sandwich into 3 parts and offered them to the cubs, along with pieces of fruit that he'd been saving for his afternoon break. It wasn't much, but it was sharing rather than taking, offering rather than demanding. The cubs accepted the food with the sort of careful gratitude that suggested they weren't entirely sure this wasn't some kind of trap, but they were hungry enough to risk it. "So," Lux said as they ate, "want to tell me what this is really about? Because I'm betting there's more to this story than cubs refuse relocation order." And slowly, between bites of sandwich and fruit, the real story began to emerge. Not the official version that would appear in security reports, but the version that 3 frightened children had been trying to communicate all along. The blast doors opened with a hiss that made everyone in the room freeze. Velka stepped through the entrance, her massive frame filling the doorway, golden scales rippling with the sort of controlled fury that made seasoned diplomats reconsider their career choices. Behind her came a parade of very important-looking beings, council representatives, embassy officials, and various other entities who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. "Mother," the cubs chorused, abandoning their defensive positions to rush toward her with the sort of joyful relief that only children could manage after thinking they might never see their parent again. Velka's expression softened as she gathered her younglings against her sides, but her eyes remained fixed on Korth with the sort of attention that suggested someone was about to have a very uncomfortable conversation. "Interesting relocation exercise," she said, her voice carrying the particular edge that diplomats used when they were being polite, but definitely not friendly. "Though I don't recall authorizing any changes to my cubs' accommodations." Korth's mandibles clicked rapidly. The relocation order came from Embassy Administration, standard protocol for managing disruptive. Disruptive? Velka's scales began to glow with heat. "My children were playing quietly until your officers decided they needed to be moved at stunner point to what you euphemistically called a secure facility. We were just trying to follow procedures." "You were following a test protocol," interrupted one of the council representatives, a being whose translator rendered their voice in the sort of crisp tones that suggested they were accustomed to ending arguments simply by speaking. "A test that you failed quite spectacularly." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as everyone processed this information. Test? Korth's voice climbed toward frequencies that his species typically reserved for genuine panic. The Galactic Council has been evaluating different species for inclusion in our new Interspecies Child Welfare Initiative, the representative continued. We needed to assess how various member species respond to crisis situations involving young beings from different cultures. Lux, who had been quietly observing from his position near the cubs, began to understand what had really been happening. So, the relocation order was fake. Completely fabricated, the representative confirmed. The cubs were briefed to respond naturally to any perceived threats, which for young Draknari means defensive flame production and pack coordination. We wanted to see how different security approaches would handle a situation involving frightened children who happened to possess dangerous capabilities. Ember looked up at Lux with wide eyes. You mean we were supposed to breathe fire at the security bugs? You were supposed to act like yourselves, Velka said gently. Which means protecting each other when adults tried to separate you unfairly. Spark bounced excitedly. So, we weren't in trouble? We were helping with an experiment? You were being yourselves, Lux said, offering the youngest cub another piece of fruit. Which apparently was exactly what they needed you to do. The council representative turned toward Korth with the sort of attention that made career advancement seem suddenly unlikely. Your response to 3 frightened children was to escalate force, call for backup, and implement siege protocols. You turned a childcare situation into a military engagement. Korth's exoskeleton seemed to shrink. They were resisting lawful orders with potentially lethal force. They were breathing small puffs of flame and hiding behind furniture, Velka pointed out with devastating accuracy. My cubs could have seriously injured your entire security team within the first 30 seconds if they'd actually wanted to hurt anyone. Instead, they spent an hour carefully disabling equipment while avoiding harm to personnel. The representative's attention shifted to Lux, who suddenly found himself the focus of several very important beings. And you approached the situation how? I brought them lunch, Lux said simply. They were scared kids who'd been separated from their mother and told they were being taken somewhere that sounded like punishment. I figured food and conversation might work better than stunners and containment fields. You violated security protocols, Korth protested weakly. I fixed a ventilation issue and shared my sandwich, Lux corrected. Everything else was just conversation. The council representative made notes on a device that looked far too advanced for simple record-keeping. Interesting approach. Results? Lux gestured toward the cubs, who were now contentedly sharing the remains of his lunch while staying close to their mother. No injuries, no trauma, no property damage beyond what had already occurred. Situation resolved through basic communication and mutual respect. The humans saw children where everyone else saw problems, Velka observed. That's exactly the perspective we need for the Child Welfare Initiative. The representative nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Lux, would you be interested in a position with our new Interspecies Childcare Coordination Program? We need individuals who can bridge cultural gaps and prioritize child welfare over administrative convenience. Lux looked at the cubs, who were watching him with the sort of hopeful attention that suggested they'd very much like to see him again. He looked at the fancy officials with their important titles and their undoubtedly impressive salaries. Then he looked at his mop and bucket, sitting abandoned in the corridor where he'd left them. Thanks, but I think I'll stick with maintenance work, he said. More opportunities to actually help people when they need it. Spark perked up immediately. Does that mean you'll still be here tomorrow? We're supposed to come back for more playing while Mother has meetings. "I'll be here," Lux assured him. "Someone's got to keep the building running properly." Ember grinned, showing off her small but impressive fangs. "And if any more security bugs try to take us to Dragon Jail?" "Well," Lux said thoughtfully, "I suspect your mother will have some very clear conversations with embassy administration about appropriate protocols for interacting with diplomatic families." Velka's scales shimmered with what might have been amusement. "Oh, yes. Very clear conversations indeed." As the various officials filed out to write reports and revise policies, Korth lingered near the doorway, looking like someone who'd just watched his career prospects go up in flames. Quite literally, in this case. "Sir," he said to Lux, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion, "how did you know they weren't actually dangerous?" Lux considered this as he gathered up the remains of lunch and prepared to return to his regular duties. "I listened to what they were saying instead of focusing on how they were saying it. Turns out, most problems get a lot simpler when you start there." The cubs waved goodbye as he headed toward the maintenance access, already planning their next day of playing, while their mother attended diplomatic meetings. They had no idea that their brief rebellion had helped reshape galactic policy on child welfare, or that their new human friend had just turned down a prestigious job offer to keep fixing broken things and cleaning up messes. They just knew that tomorrow, if any security officers tried to push them around, there would be someone nearby who understood the difference between dangerous criminals and scared children who breathed fire. And sometimes, that understanding made all the difference in the galaxy.